it's a very great pleasure tonight, not only to welcome so many of you, but also to welcome Tom Switzer, who's one of our most eminent and popular speakers. As you know, because that's why you're here, his address tonight is about Ukraine, NATO expansion, and a new Cold War. Tom brings to this address the analysis of international affairs that he brings to bear on the basis of the realist approach to international affairs of the eminent Owen Harries, an international strategist of considerable eminence and the subject of a biography written by Tom. Owen was an advisor to the Fraser government on foreign policy way back in 1975. And well, his realism is the basis of what Tom has to say tonight. I'm not going to make any comments on the subject because that's over to Tom.
Well, thank you very much, Ian. It's great to be back at the Australian Institute for International Affairs. I've spoken here at the New South Wales branch several occasions, and I've been very lucky to speak at the Queensland, Victorian, Western Australian and South Australian branches. And it's great to see some young people here today. I remember once when I was young, in the early 90s, when I was an undergraduate student, and one of my teachers was Dr. Jim Angel. I just see here, he was the president of 1975 to 79 here at the Institute, and Jim taught me a course called Australia and the Third World in 1992, and he introduced me to the Australian Institute, and I was one of the interns back then. So it's a reminder that teachers, Jim, we lost Jim about 15 years ago, it's a reminder that teachers and lecturers can have a profound and positive impact on their students. So I think of Jim, and not just my friend Owen Harries that Ian mentioned. This evening I don't want to just simply talk about Ukraine, but I want to put Ukraine in a broader historical context by going back to the 1990s when the issue of NATO expansion was a big issue in Washington. And I want to do this because I think that one of the real problems with public discourse these days, particularly with the digital media onslaught, is a reluctance by policymakers, politicians, journalists, even the public at large, to not put things in a broader historical context, to act in the immediacy of the moment, to, as my friend and mentor Owen Harries once put it, indulge in what he called the parochialism of the present, which is a tendency to believe that what is happening to us here and now is of unprecedented significance. So let me just say a few things first about Ukraine before I put this in a broader context. I think it is fair to say, despite what you might read in much of the mainstream media, that Ukraine is in serious trouble on the battleground. A year or so ago, it was widely believed, as the US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan put it, quote, "Russia has already lost the war." Today, though, it's the Ukrainians who are outgunned, outmanned, and slowly but surely collapsing on the battlefield. Get this, since the invasion, Ukraine has lost about a third of its population. Much of the country's infrastructure and industries have been devastated. The average age of the Ukrainian frontline troops is 43. Extraordinary. Meanwhile, Russia's economy has withstood the Western sanctions during the course of the last 2 years. So if the West's campaign to support Ukraine fails, it'll be tragic for those in Ukraine who long for freedom, peace and stability. For the Americans and their allies, it will involve a certain amount of humiliation. My argument this evening is that it's to be hoped that it will also bring an end to an illusion about America's dealings with Russia for much of the post-Cold War era, a way of thinking that continues to hurt US interests and prestige in utterly changed circumstances. This belief reached its peak in 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine, and the Western consensus was not surprisingly that this was unprovoked and therefore a violation of what's called the rules-based liberal international order. And the consensus view was that Moscow's aggression was all about Vladimir Putin's imperial impulse, that is, his desire to create a greater Russian empire. And as I said before, for the West, obviously this includes Australians, this was an understandable judgment. 3 decades earlier, in the early 1990s, America had won the Cold War, and according to Francis Fukuyama, we're at the end of history. That is, the end point of humankind's ideological evolution and the universalisation of Western liberal democracy and market economics. Self-determination, the argument went, trumps power politics. In the face of the Russian bully's aggression in February 2022, we wanted to declare solidarity with the little guy, stand up for what's right, and condemn what's wrong. Which of course is why the US and its allies, including Australia, has provided so much aid and military support to the Ukrainians, who are, after all, just defending their territorial sovereignty. However, the Russians, and they are an important player in this, they see things differently, as do indeed much of the non-Western world. In international affairs, as the late Henry Kissinger argued, it helps to try to look at the world from our opponent's perspective. Now, this does not justify Russia's brutal assault on Ukraine, but understanding Moscow's thinking will help ameliorate the marked tensions that have defined the West's relations with Russia for much of the post-Cold War era. And if we understand the Kremlin's motivations, its conduct is easier to understand, which is not to say we must like it, much less endorse it. Now, as it happens, and this is my thesis this evening, 3 decades ago, we had some serious warnings of Russia's strategic sensibilities about NATO expansion. Back then, and I was very fortunate to be working in Washington in the mid to late 1990s at a neoconservative think tank called the American Enterprise Institute, one of the best jobs I ever had. But during that period, there was a campaign to bring Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic under American nuclear umbrella, under NATO. And at the time, many leading military and foreign policy thinkers strongly believed that enlargement of NATO would lead to big trouble with Russia. It would create the very danger it was supposed to prevent, Russian aggression in reaction to what the Kremlin would deem a provocative and threatening Western policy. Now, the list of opponents of NATO enlargement from 3 decades ago reads like a who's who list of that generation's wise men. And they were mainly men. It included the architects of the Cold War doctrine of containment in the late 1940s and early 1950s, George Kennan and Paul Nitze. It also included architects of or leading players in the Reagan, Carter, Ford, and Nixon administrations in intelligence, defence, foreign policy, just generally. It also included leading intellectuals and magazine editors, and not least the distinguished historians, Donald Kagan, Richard Pipes, John Lewis Gaddis, Robert Conquest, and Sir Michael Howard, arguably Britain's foremost strategic thinker at the time. Officials in the State and Defence Departments, this is in the Clinton administration, also rejected NATO plans to expand eastwards. They included the Polish-born chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, John Saakashvili, the first Defence Secretary in the Clinton administration, Les Aspin, that's him over there, and his successor, William Perry, who actually threatened to resign in late 1994 after the Clinton administration cabinet decided to move plans forward for NATO expansion. Then there were former Defence Secretaries Robert McNamara from the Kennedy and Johnson administration, James Schlesinger, who was a Cabinet Secretary in the Nixon, Ford and Carter administrations. Their argument was that NATO enlargement would decrease Allied security and unsettle European stability. In the lead up to the Senate's ratification of NATO expansion in 1998, the New York Times editorial board warned the most important foreign policy decision America has faced since the end of the Cold War could prove to be a mistake of historic proportions. And this: it is delusional to believe that NATO expansion is not at its core an act that Russia will regard as hostile. Now, of course, the liberal-leaning New York Times was hardly alone. In fact, many of the opponents of NATO expansion, they came from a wide variety of ideological perspectives. Noam Chomsky on the left and Pat Buchanan on the right, who was a Republican presidential candidate in 1992 and 1996. Tonight I want to talk about three critics of NATO expansion that I believe distinguished themselves during this period in the mid to late 1990s. Obviously, the aforementioned George Kennan, my friend and mentor, the Australian Owen Harries, and the aforementioned Pat Buchanan, the Republican firebrand. And although they expressed themselves in different ways, they highlighted not just the folly of rubbing Russia's nose in its Cold War defeat, but also the ominous consequences of giving security guarantees to the former captive nations of Eastern and Central Europe. Let's start with Buchanan. He was, as I mentioned before, a Republican presidential candidate. He served in the Nixon and Reagan administrations as a senior media advisor, and he wrote a regular column that was nationally syndicated. And he railed against what he saw was a new Cold War with Russia. In 1994, he noted that if Cold War presidents Dwight Eisenhower and Lyndon Johnson backed away from confrontation with Russia over Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968, quote, "Why would we risk a clash with Moscow when the Cold War is over?" NATO expansion, Buchanan warned, quote, "is a prescription for a NATO-Russia clash as soon as the nationalists come to power in Moscow." And 3 years later, in 1997, he lamented that agonising Moscow meant driving her towards China and Iran. George Kennan, well, as I mentioned before, he was the author of the Containment Doctrine under the Truman administration in 1947. He was a former US ambassador to the Soviet Union, and he was widely regarded as one of America's wisest minds on the question of Russia. And he spoke, and he was in his mid-90s, in 1997. He wrote an op-ed piece for the New York Times where he warned that NATO expansion would be the most fateful era of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. His argument was it would weaken Russian reformers, embolden hardliners, undermine strategic arms agreements, and escalate East-West tensions, and this is a crucial point, when Russia got back on its feet and began acting like a great power. He wrote that in 1997. Now, context is everything. In the 1990s, Russia was a very weak power. It was certainly no threat to the West, and it was incapable of serious and purposeful military action, even in its near abroad. But as Owen Harries, the other distinguished opponent of NATO expansion, warned, quote, "If humiliated further and made desperate, Russia could be dangerous in a way that a wounded animal can be dangerous." Its potential as a troublemaker, Harries argued, was huge. A sick Russia with a vast arsenal of nuclear weapons would one day get well and declare its own Monroe Doctrine. And for those of you who haven't studied American diplomatic history, a Monroe Doctrine, which was coined in the 1820s by President Monroe, is about the United States as a rising great power asserting a sphere of influence in its own hemisphere. All great powers in history have done so. Now, Harries, a Welsh-born conservative academic and Cold Warrior, no stranger to some of you in the room, he argued, and he's also the editor of the Washington-based National Interest from 1985 to 2001, that's how I got to know him. He wrote, "Expanding NATO violates the wise principle enunciated by Winston Churchill, in victory, magnanimity. Churchill was no softy, but he recognised the stupidity of grinding the face of a defeated foe in the dirt." Other prominent Australians, most notably Harry's former boss Malcolm Fraser, who was Prime Minister from 1975 to 1983, and Paul Keating, Prime Minister from 1991 to 1996, they also warned that NATO expansion eastwards would provoke the bear. This is Paul Keating in 1997. He was at the University of New South Wales. That's the quote. Ponder that. Another central tenet of the Harries, Kennan, Buchanan critique was that NATO expansion could suffer a massive credibility problem. Ends and means, Walter Lippmann, one of the great public intellectuals of 20th century America, he famously warned in 1943 that ends and means ought to be brought into balance and aspirations should match resources in any foreign policy deliberations. It's a fundamental rule of statecraft. You need ends and means to balance. Otherwise, you just won't have the resources to subsidise your military ventures. And yet, here we are in the 1990s. Here's the United States cashing in on the so-called peace dividend at the end of the Cold War by cutting defence spending and its army and naval troop levels, even as Washington added security commitments in a part of the world where even Cold War presidents felt America had no vital interest in justifying a risk of war. Meanwhile, European allies were slashing their own defence budgets and downsizing their own militaries. And Harries made the point that the irresponsibility of such conduct raised the question of the seriousness of the new commitments being undertaken. Harries, Kennan and Buchanan were among those who also drew attention to the US and German assurances given to Moscow during the early 1990s that if Russia or the Soviets withdrew from their Warsaw Pact client states and accepted German unification, NATO, according to Jim Baker, who was the Secretary of State, would not move 1 inch eastwards. 1 inch eastwards. By expanding NATO up to the frontiers of the former Soviet Union, which started to happen in the mid to late 1990s, this was the argument that they were making. Washington would repudiate this implicit agreement with Mikhail Gorbachev, lest the demise of the Soviet Union unleash the kind of chaos and bloodshed that often characterises the collapse of other empires. The English realist Martin Wright had a great quote: "Great power status is lost as it is won, by violence. A great power does not die in its stead." It's a lovely quote. But what happened in the case of the Soviet Union was truly unprecedented. It was the exception to the rule. Remember, context is important. From 1989 to 1991, the Kremlin turned loose all of its satellites. It allowed the Berlin Wall to fall, Germany to be united, and of course the USSR was dissolved into 15 independent nations. All this with virtually no bloodshed. Again, it's unprecedented. When you think about the British withdrawal from the Indian subcontinent, or Kenya or Malaysia, violence, bloodshed. Same thing for the French when they withdrew from Algeria and Vietnam. Even the Belgians when they left Congo, bloodshed in its wake. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was a relatively peaceful process. And this miracle, if you like, took place in no small part, this is my view, because President Bush Sr., Secretary of State James Baker, the whole foreign policy team, which included Colin Powell and Brent Scowcroft, they refused to exploit Russia's security vulnerabilities. I mentioned before Jim Baker saying NATO would not expand eastwards if Russia lets go of its empire gently. Now, our critics, or my critics, would say there was no formal treaty to codify this agreement, and that is true. It's one of Gorbachev's biggest mistakes. But America had given Russia its word and then suddenly broke it. This is George Kennan. "We did not, I am sure, intend to trick the Russians. The actual determinants of our later behaviour, that is expanding NATO," he said this in 1998, "would scarcely have been more credible on our part than a real intention to deceive." It was around this time that the eminent historian John Lewis Gaddis, who actually went on to become a biographer of George Kennan, he said he's one of the greatest historians or most distinguished historians in America over the last 40 years. He said he had great difficulty in finding any colleagues who think NATO expansion is a good idea. "I can recall no other moment when there was less support in our profession for a government policy." Meanwhile, and this is very important for tonight's talk, the broad cross-section of the Russian political elite, including Boris Johnson and the pro-Western reformers, they remained alarmed at the prospect of NATO expansion. The Kremlin pointed out that Washington would not tolerate Moscow forming a military alliance with Cuba or Venezuela or Mexico and then planting Russian missiles in those countries. So why would Russia accept the US doing the equivalent in Central and Eastern Europe? As Pat Buchanan put it in 1997, this is a great quote: "If democratic Russia gave a war guarantee to Mexico and began arming and training Mexican troops, no soothing assurances would diminish our resolve, America's resolve, to get the Russians out of our hemisphere." In 1998, I mentioned the New York Times editorials, President Clinton had not argued his case to the American people. And in his January State of the Union address, this is 1998, months before the Senate ratified NATO expansion, which was a signature Clinton administration foreign policy initiative, the President, believe it or not, spent less than 1 minute of his hour-long speech setting out his case for NATO expansion. And at the time, some of you may remember this, in early 1998, there was a very famous movie called Titanic. There's been a few Titanic movies, but this is obviously the most famous. It became the highest grossing movie of its time. And this is Susan Eisenhower. She's the granddaughter of Dwight Eisenhower, the former president and the head of the American military during World War II. Like the captain of that ill-fated liner, Clinton has been warned that icebergs are everywhere, but he's steaming full speed ahead, ignoring what may lie beneath the surface, insisting that our vessel is indestructible and unsinkable. That was Susan Eisenhower. And yet, in April of 1998, the President, Clinton, and he was backed by arms manufacturers, hawkish think tanks, where I was working at the time, AEI, the interventionist wing of the Republican Party, and this is crucial, ethnic Central and Eastern European voting blocs. He was able to push the first of what would become 3 tranches of NATO expansion, so Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. And he got that through the Republican-controlled Senate very easily. Shortly after that day, George Kenner gave an interview to Thomas Friedman. Some of you may read Thomas Friedman in the New York Times these days. Back then he was a news reporter, and he quoted Kennan. This is what Kennan said just before he died. "I think this NATO expansion is the beginning of a new Cold War. Of course, there's going to be a bad reaction from Russia. And then the NATO expanders will say, 'We always told you that is how the Russians are.' But this is just wrong." And I should stress again, he was widely regarded as one of America's wisest minds on Russia. So what does this history tell us? I think it shows the extent to which a lot of prominent intellectuals, columnists, former policymakers, politicians, both Democrat and Republican, had serious doubts about NATO expansion in the mid to late 1990s for fear of provoking Russia. And yet, as they consistently warned about a near certain confrontation with post-Yeltsin Russia, it's important to note that these opponents of NATO expansion, we're talking about the mid to late 90s here, they were never dismissed as Kremlin apologists or Russia's useful idiots. Nor were they treated as if their views were outside the boundaries of serious public discourse. Today, however, the intellectual climate is very different. If anyone, including prominent thinkers like Professor John Mearsheimer, a good friend and mentor of mine, and the economist Jeffrey Sachs, if anyone blames NATO expansion for the Ukraine crisis, they instantly arouse anger and suspicion about their motives. John's been called so many times now a Putin puppet or in the pay of the Kremlin. These two are exceedingly popular on social media. In fact, just the other day I did an event with John in Sydney. We've got 1.8 million views on YouTube, extraordinary. He's actually done 20 separate events on YouTube during the course of the last 2 years since the invasion of Ukraine, and they've each attracted more than 1 million views on YouTube. So they're both very popular on social media, but they're virtually ignored across mainstream media outlets across the Western world, particularly in the United States. New York Times used to publish John once, twice a year on its op-ed page in the 80s, 90s and 2000s. But this Ukraine crisis means he's persona non grata. He hasn't been invited, and they haven't published his articles on Ukraine since the Crimean crisis of 2014. Never mind that these two distinguished scholars are just reaffirming the views of Harries, Kennan, Buchanan, and the New York Times, among others, in the 1990s. So what's changed in 3 decades? Why are today's opponents of NATO expansion treated with such contempt and derision? Well, I think the answer lies in understanding the power of media and institutional groupthink. Now, in the case of Ukraine, as my friend Ted Galen Carpenter, who's been a long-time scholar at the Libertarian Cato Institute in Washington, he's written a terrific book, and I had an interview with him on my old ABC Radio National program last year. The book's called Unreliable Watchdog of the News Media and US Foreign Policy. It's published last year. His argument is that establishment journalists tend to, quote, portray a complex situation as a shallow melodrama with nearly all blame put on one side. Meanwhile, it's my contention that much of what passes for as original thinking on US foreign policy in 2021, 22, 23 and 24, which is to say the Biden era, that amounts to a policy agenda from an earlier generation that culminated in the disasters of Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, so on and so forth. And the argument here, and you'll often hear this from the President himself, but also his national security team, that the United States, infused with the belief that it is fundamentally different from other nations in its motives, intentions and behaviour, should exercise benign global leadership and promote liberal democracy around the world. What does that sound like? To me, that sounds a lot like President George W. Bush in the lead up to the Iraq War. And so that's why we have the President declaring that America is back. Francis Fukuyama, who coined the term the end of history, the triumph of Western liberal democracy in the late 80s, early 1990s, he claims that Ukraine's fight represents, quote, the spirit of 1989 and a new birth of freedom. So my point here is that this narrative, especially when it compares with Donald Trump's America First, so-called isolationist agenda, that has wide appeal among Western, especially American elites. And we should stress, Ukraine was invaded by Russia. It was the first major war in Europe since World War II, and Russia was clearly the aggressor. Moreover, there is a history of revanchist attitudes in Moscow, and I'll be frank, to show that I'm not in the pay of the Kremlin, Putin's thuggish and autocratic persona helps confirm the widespread view in the West that Russia took up arms exclusively because of its imperialistic ambitions, not because of anything the US and its allies did, including NATO expansion. But this is my point here now. Although the Western conventional wisdom insists that Russia is inherently expansionist, the Russian armies lack the military power to conquer all of Ukraine, much less countries in the erstwhile Warsaw Pact. As I said to the students beforehand, a Russia that is having its work cut out in Donbass poses no serious military threat to Eastern and Central Europe. Nor has Putin ever expressed serious interest in making all of Ukraine part of Russia, much less reconstituting the Russian Empire. Now, I know that's a controversial thing to say. Happy to flesh it out in Q&A. I think, and this is also the view of Mearsheimer and Sachs, Putin's strategic objectives appear more limited. He wants to annex eastern, predominantly ethnic Russian Ukrainian territory and badly weaken the country, so it's in no position to join NATO. I mentioned before, I'm a bit late here, sorry, Imogen, President Biden, Francis Fukuyama, whom I quoted just a few moments ago. Now, the popular Western narrative insists that the West should never allow Russian saber-rattling to deny sovereign peoples their right to join NATO. That's the overwhelming consensual wisdom. And you'll read this in the left-wing Guardian, as much as the right-wing Australian, the Independent in Britain, which is on the left, Tory right, Daily Telegraph, the liberal New York Times these days, and the conservative Wall Street Journal. This is the overwhelming consensus in the Western world. My response to that argument is there was, and indeed remains, an indispensable corollary, As the critics warned in the 1990s, it was inevitable that Russia, with an improving economy thanks to its gas and oil exports, as well as Putin's success in re-establishing a functioning state, it was inevitable that Russia would eventually push back at a US-dominated military alliance encroaching on its borders. Great powers, as Charles de Gaulle once remarked, are cold monsters, and they will react strongly to the intrusion of a rival great power into what it regards as its sphere of influence. And no great power has been more insistent than the US in playing hardball in protecting its near abroad. Latin Americans can attest to that. So, in conclusion, I think the grim reality is that we are facing the prospect of a frozen conflict in Ukraine, and that's coupled with Russia annexing even more Ukrainian territory. And this will leave Ukraine as a broken rump state. This is a tragedy for sure, but it almost certainly could have been avoided if US leaders had heeded the warnings of the many wise opponents of NATO expansion in the 1990s. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. We now have a good half hour for questions. I do ask that you stand up if you wouldn't mind and identify yourself if you wish, but above all, wait for the intern with the microphone to reach you.
I should encourage interns to ask questions too.
Hello, and my name is Narelle Ryan. What I'm interested, Tom, and if you don't mind me giving a little background, and that was a recent BBC interview with Mike Pompeo. And his line now was that basically Putin is a puppet of China because China is basically providing so much basic infrastructure, I suppose, of knowledge to support the war effort. But that nowadays, very different to what Trump had said before, that he is saying that they would come in and arm in a much stronger way the Ukraine and allow the missiles, the long-range missiles, which are not allowed to go into Russia at the moment, to go in. But what I saw as an underlying message, and I love your comment on this, is that they see great opportunities for the reconstruction of Ukraine, obviously if they win. What is your belief about if Trump wins and what it will mean for the Ukraine, given the results of polls at the moment?
Well, I think the problem with predicting what President Trump will do in a second term is
That's difficult.
it's very difficult because he is an unpredictable character.
That's very true.
But my sense from following his pronouncements on Russia policy in recent times is that he would be likely to want to shut the conflict down as quickly as possible. And that means putting pressure on the Ukrainians to accept the status quo, which is essentially Russia having, at this stage, 20% of Ukrainian territory, possibly more by January, February next year, when he would come to power, if he comes to power. The problem that Trump's got, though, is that the Ukrainians and much of the West still believe that we should be supporting the Ukrainians as long as it takes. That's the language. And it would be humiliating for the Americans and especially the Ukrainians to accept Russia's demands that they have annexed 20% of Ukraine and also force the Ukrainians to jettison any idea of them becoming part of NATO.
Can I just say, what about the warmongers in those that support Trump? And I won't say anymore.
Well, I think, again, Trump is hard to pigeonhole. You say warmongers, but let's remember that during his first term from early 2017 to early 2021, no war occurred on his watch. And he's proud of that boast. I think his instincts are non-interventionism. I think he distinguishes himself from not just the liberal interventionists like Joe Biden, but especially the neocons, or the neoconservatives, who had massive sway in US foreign policy making after September 11. And that in Trump's judgment, and I think this is a safe terrain for Trump, that led to a lot of debacles, like the Iraq War. He calls them forever wars, Afghanistan. So I think Trump instinctively recognises that the American people are sick and tired of fighting these wars. So I don't think he's necessarily surrounded by warmongers. And even if he were, like John Bolton, for example, you mentioned former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, he's his own man. He'll do things that is against the advice of his warmongering advisors. He's a hard guy to understand, Trump. And I'm no expert, but from everything I've seen, I don't think he's gunning for new wars. I think he wants to shut down this conflict. I think it would be different in Asia. I think my sense is that he probably wants, to the extent that he has foreign policy priorities, he would certainly like to reorder priorities in favour of Asia, because he probably sees China as a greater threat than Russia. And on the Middle East, I don't see any evidence that he would change policy from the Biden policy, which would mean to give essentially unconditional, unqualified support to Israel. I don't see him changing on those issues.
Thanks, Tom. This lady here.
Okay, Olga. From Ukraine.
Okay, I'm Ukrainian born, and I'm holding dual citizenship. And what else? And I'm completing masters in Sydney Uni. So.
What subject? What subject?
Subject political science.
Uh-huh.
So it's like I'm not affected of anything like Russia.
So you feel you're at a lecture right now?
So I would like to say, Tom, you're extremely brave. And my question is like, why in States you hear different voices like you do for a long time? Here in Australia, okay, maybe Cory Bernardi and Liz Storer.
Yeah.
They're talking differently.
Sky News,
Yeah. So my question is, why Australia is so conservative, and they don't, and here people don't see this, that the king is naked.
Yeah, I think, to be fair, it's not just Australia, it's much of the Western world. If you did polls in the course of the last 2 years since the Ukraine crisis broke out, significant majority of peoples in the Western countries would support their governments for supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes. And I think part of the reason is that gets back to my initial point about indulging in the parochialism of the present. So you'll have a lot of the boosters of Western support for Ukraine comparing Vladimir Putin to Adolf Hitler.
Yeah.
And I just think that's a ridiculous analogy. Not least, I'll give you an example why. When Hitler went into Western Poland in 1939, he committed 1.4 million troops to conquer and occupy Western Poland. Now bear in mind, Poland is about 1/3, I think, roughly the size of Ukraine. When Putin went into Ukraine in February of 2022, he committed 190,000 troops. Not 1.4 million, 190,000 troops. He didn't want to conquer and occupy all of Ukraine, it was impossible. He wanted to put pressure on Kiev to declare their neutrality, as he'd been trying to do for the previous few years with Biden, get them to declare their neutrality and rule out NATO membership, because this was a bright red line for Russians across the political board, including Navalny, who died recently. He was seen as a liberal critic of Putin, but even he opposed NATO expansion into Ukraine.
Next question.
Chris Skinner. I have noted that you haven't really given much prominence to the Russian invasion of Crimea in 2014 and the encouragement of the lack of NATO or any other response that may have encouraged Putin to think that 190,000 troops was all he needed. But my question is, you also have not mentioned the nuclear warfare implications of both NATO on the one hand, which offers a nuclear umbrella to its members, and the posturing that Putin has indulged in threatening possible nuclear action. Would it be a reasonable expectation that NATO will not expand any further and will not include Ukraine, and Putin will be happy to sign up to the new borders, rather like he did in 2014 with Crimea, and everything will get back to sort of normal?
Good questions. Your last one, I'd say the problem here is that the goals of both Russia on the one hand and Ukraine and the West on the other hand are fundamentally incompatible. So the Ukrainians want their territory back. You can't blame them. They want the 20% of their land that Russia has back.
Sure, but
Russia,
they don't have the resources to achieve
I agree with you. I'm just saying that the goals here to reach a ceasefire are incompatible. The Russians won't tolerate that. They want to keep that 20%, presumably. The other point is that Ukraine still wants to be part of NATO. Biden and Brussels keep talking about including Ukraine in part of NATO. That's a red flag for the Russians. They won't tolerate that. So you've got two fundamentally incompatible goals here for the major parties. That's why I think it's ultimately going to be a frozen conflict. Now, on Crimea, I didn't mention Crimea, and you're right to point that out, but again, I think it's a similar story. I think that what happened in Crimea in February of 2014 with the Western-backed coup to bring down the Yanukovych government, who was a pro-Russian autocrat, although, mind you, he was democratically elected, but leaving that aside, he was a bit of a thuggish character. From Putin's perspective, from Russia's perspective, they saw the West helping bring down an ally in its sphere of influence, toppling the regime. I mean, you had John McCain, long-time Republican senator, and Victoria Nuland, a prominent Democratic policymaker, handing out pastry to the protesters. Imagine how Washington would feel if Russian diplomats were handing out tacos and enchiladas to Mexicans who are opposed to American foreign policy. And the Americans the Americans got worked up about that Chinese balloon early last year. Imagine how they react to China or China or Russia having security pacts with Mexico. So I think from Russia's perspective, they wanted to go into Crimea, which is predominantly ethnic Russian, and it's also, more importantly, the home of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. So that's why I think Putin went into Crimea. The critics would say in response that the reason why he went in there is because Obama had shown weakness over the Syrian dictator Assad's decision to use chemical weapons the year before. And that is true. Neither the Americans nor the British honoured their commitment to enforce a red line and punish Syria for using chemical weapons. But I don't think that's the reason why Putin went into Crimea. I think he was focused on more immediate threats to his own sphere of influence.
We have two questions in the front row. Let's start here.
I'm just wondering what you think of the future for Georgia then.
Georgia's an interesting. I don't have any strong views on that. I don't think it's going to become part of NATO, but it was at the Bucharest summit in 2008, April 2008. Then President George W. Bush wanted to include Georgia and Ukraine as part of NATO, and again, Putin made it very clear that this was unacceptable. And even I think the French president at the time, Sarkozy, and the German Chancellor Angela Merkel thought that this was pushing things. But it just happened by coincidence that a few months later, when there was a breakout of hostilities within Georgia, that Russia intervened because they saw it as a threat to their near abroad. My understanding is that Georgia is not a serious contender to be a member of NATO anytime soon, but it's still very much part of Russia's sphere of influence. Georgia is in a much better position than Ukraine for obvious reasons. The problem for Ukraine is that it's going to end up being a broken state, a dysfunctional rump state. Whether it's 20% or 30% of Ukraine is part of Russia, you wait and see. But Georgia doesn't have that problem.
How much money and how much influence did the military corporations have on governments to push NATO expansion?
I don't have a specific answer in response to that question in terms of dollars, but significantly, yes, no question about it. In the 1990s, a lot of the so-called military-industrial complex arms manufacturers were very supportive of the idea. It was good for business. I'm not justifying, I'm just explaining.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have 4 questions coming up. 1, 2, 3, and 4.
Thank you, Tom, for a terrific speech, as always. And I know that you're concentrating on NATO and the Cold War this evening, but you have highlighted the contradictions in US policy. And I think we're confronting one right now, which I'd like your opinion about. On the one hand, we have the US 2 years ago firmly backing the International Court of Justice about declaring Putin a war criminal for his invasion of Ukraine. At the moment, we have the United States bending over backwards not to do the same about Netanyahu in Israel, where clearly exactly the same thing is happening, and worse, because it's genocide. What is going to be the outcome of that contradiction?
Well, it's a good question, and Gideon Ruckman from the Financial Times has written a piece today that's been reprinted in the Financial Review on this very subject. The Americans are hypocrites. Are hypocrites. They're hypocrites in championing what's called the rules-based liberal international order. But see, I mean, Alison raises a good question. Again, the conventional wisdom, until recently at least, was that it was Donald Trump that was responsible for bringing down the rules-based liberal international order. But remember, in 2003, the United States invaded Iraq without any UN backing. Yeah. That was hardly in keeping with the rules-based liberal international order. I think this rules-based liberal international order is just rhetoric. I think ultimately it disguises power politics, where great powers play hardball to protect their interests. And Russia and America are no different in that regard. There might be a difference in tone. I think the Americans strike a better tone than the Russians. But all great powers will play hardball to protect their vital strategic interests in their near abroad. America's done it in Latin America, Russia's doing it in the near abroad, and China is slowly but surely doing it in the South China Sea.
Next question, back to the room, Matt.
Hello, thank you very much for your presentation. My question is, what comes after Putin? Russia today has one of the fastest aging populations in the world. Almost a quarter of the population of today's Russia are non-Russian. There's a historic trace of separatism in the country, Tatarstan or Chechnya, or Ingushetia, for example. So could you foresee in a wild scenario a possible balkanization of Russia like we saw in the former Soviet Union?
Oh, I don't know if I'd go that far, but you're absolutely right to highlight those underlying trends that handicap Russia. I mean, demography is a really big issue. Mind you, China has the same problem, as does Japan, Taiwan and South Korea. America's in a much better position because of its immigration and fertility rates. But yeah, you're right, Russia's demography is heading in the wrong direction. They also place a lot of emphasis on fossil fuels, most notably gas and oil. And if we are moving to a net zero world, that is a diminishing asset to have. I say if, because I still think that those fossil fuels will have plenty of life left in them. But as for separatist movements, well, my sense is, without being an expert on Russian public opinion, but the intervention in Ukraine has been broadly popular. Because a lot of Russian people have recognised that Ukraine is a flat land that Napoleon from France to Hitler from Germany crossed to attack Russia. These are very sensitive issues for Russians. So I think they broadly support Putin. But he has been in power for 25 years, which is an extremely long tenure for anyone these days. He might have another 5 years left in him, but I can't predict what's going to happen in Russia. I just know that they'll continue to play hardball to protect its vital strategic interests. And let's remember, Russia is a stronger country than it was in the 1990s. And if you went back in the 1990s and said that Russia would be, intervening in the near abroad, I mean, you had people like George Kennan saying that they would, but not many people would have believed you. And I think that's due in large part to Putin's ability to rebuild Russian institutions and the nation state, when it was really very weak in the 1990s under Boris Yeltsin.
You mentioned, so you didn't mention about Finland and how, at least to my knowledge, Russia hasn't, they obviously protested against it, but haven't sort of done as much celebrating or flag waving over it as I thought they would when it was announced. I think you brought up one of the reasons I think they haven't is because it's not as geostrategically valuable to them as it is. But do you think once the Ukraine issue is settled, whichever way that goes, however long that takes, do you think they'll turn their eyes to Finland and perhaps not in terms of invasion, but kick up more of a stink, to put it lightly?
Yeah, possibly, but as you say, I don't think it's on par with the strategic importance of Ukraine, to a lesser extent Georgia. there is, as you mentioned, geography.
We have a question here, and then in the back of the room, and finally there. So those are the next three.
See my old lecturer back there, Bob? Feel free to ask a question, mate. Test your student.
No. You've answered too little,
Tom, a very cogent and fact-filled address. Thank you very much. It's good stuff.
Did you, I mean, you follow this pretty closely, but did you know the extent of the opposition to NATO expansion from NATO's elite thinkers?
Yes, I did.
You did?
Yes, I did. And don't forget, there was a promise that in exchange for Russia agreeing to the unification of Germany, we will not expand any further, as you have said. My question
Although that was never codified, to be fair.
No, it wasn't, that's right, to their mistake. What about, why is France, my question, why is France so committed, in fact, to put NATO troops into Ukraine?
Well, he hasn't said
why
that.
Is Germany?
They
haven't said that, but that's the indication. It's clear to any tactician that this is something that could be avoided, and to tone down the temperature of the whole thing. And I also agree with you about Trump. He's a wild card. He could do something to prevent this getting out of control.
Well, look at Macron, although he expresses himself in different ways, he himself is a bit of a wild card. I mean, at the beginning of this crisis, in January, February of 2022, he went to great lengths to go to Russia to meet with Putin to try to convince him not to get involved, and he understood publicly he understood his strategic sensibilities. But now he's talking a completely different game. I can't understand that. But it's dramatically opposed to what he was thinking at the beginning of the crisis.
And Germany?
I think they're torn on the issue. I think there's more division in Germany. I don't know enough about German public opinion. But I will say this, next month there will be European parliamentary elections. And my sense from what I can tell is that a lot of these countries in Western Europe, like Germany and France, will pre-select or elect to the European Parliament many legislators, predominantly on the so-called far right. And they have their grievances about immigration and lax border controls and net zero climate targets, but they're also concerned about the Ukraine crisis. And most of those so-called far-right politicians, and they'll get a big bounce out of these elections, they oppose arming Ukraine against Russia, with very rare exceptions. And that's interesting. So I think there is a lot of division in Germany and France.
Yeah.
And I think the longer this war goes on, there'll be more scepticism, because they'll be asking, quite understandably, we're spending all this money year in, year out to help Ukraine, and they're going backwards.
Yeah.
And my view is that all this aid is just a tantamount to throwing it down a rat hole. You're prolonging the war, and more Ukrainians will get killed. Because as I said at the outset, they are outmanned and outgunned by the Russians.
The US are fighting to the last Ukrainian.
That's exactly the line. James Curran and I have used that a few times. I think that's exactly right. Isn't that tragic? I think the Americans and the British and Brussels have led the Ukrainians down the primrose path. I'll just give you an example. In early April of 2022, so 6 weeks after the invasion, there were high-level diplomatic discussions between the Ukrainians and the Russians. It was overseen by the Turks and the Israelis, led by the former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. And the widespread consensus was in early April, Zelensky was prepared to accept Russia's demand that they not become part of NATO, and that Russia could keep the 7% of Ukraine that Russia had after the Crimean intervention and the Donbass civil war in 2014-2015. He was very close to signing the deal with Putin. And then Boris Johnson and Joe Biden, aided by Brussels, the headquarters of NATO, discourage Zelensky and say, we'll have your back, we will fight for you as long as it takes. Well, it's 2 years later. Do you know how much Russia has of Ukraine now? 20%, not 7%. And the longer this war goes on, Russia's going to get more territory. Now, our critics, my critics, would say, you've got to stand up to this, because if we don't, Russia will take over all of Ukraine. But they haven't got the capabilities, as I mentioned. They only went into the conflict with 190,000 troops. Russia's bogged down in Donbass, but they're beating Ukraine because they're stronger than Ukraine. The idea that they will swallow all of Ukraine, that's mainly ethnically Ukrainian, not Russian, is tantamount to swallowing a giant porcupine. But this is a minority view. This is a very minority view, what I'm saying. Natalia.
You're next, Natalia.
Thank you, John McCormick. I've got a military background, and I saw
served 2 tours in Vietnam, and your immediacy of the moment is not new. After I got back, I was able to go to uni and do some thinking and studying, and I found that Vietnam's only ever had one enemy, always has, and that still is China.
Yeah.
Why didn't we know that? But back to your brilliant presentation. It's a problem that I have considered, and a number of military guys have considered, as we go in our 2-year cycles of in and out of Canberra. Why do you think we military hierarchy and your military bureaucracy are not able to convince our politicians and their advisors of what is logical and sensible? Over.
Well, the first point I make about Vietnam is, did you say you served 2 tours of duty in Vietnam?
Yeah, I was a slow learner.
You know, my father was a US Marine in Vietnam, and he, during his one major tour in the late 60s, you probably remember this, a lot of the US servicemen would come to Sydney for R&R, rest and recuperation, and he went to a pub in King's Cross, it's now no longer exists, called the Bourbon and Beef Steak. And anyway, on this night in the early 70s, he met a very attractive Sydney nurse. 9 months later I was born, so I can never criticise our involvement in Vietnam, otherwise I would never have been born. No, you're quite right about China. That's the main enemy from Vietnam. It's not France or America. Look, I think you should never underestimate the power of groupthink. I quoted T. Garland Carpenter, who talked, I forgot the exact quote, but it was along the lines that groupthink is a very powerful complex. And in this case, establishment journalists tend to portray a complex situation as a shallow melodrama with nearly all blame put on one side. And from, you know, the relentless digital media environment, your initial reaction is to say, Russia has invaded a sovereign state, Russia's the bad guy, Ukraine's the good guys, we should support the good guys. And it has a powerful hold over Western imagination. But as many non-Westerners will say, it's more complicated, and I'll try to put the other side here today. But it's hard slug. John Michel once said to me, changing public opinion on this question is like turning the trajectory of an ocean, of a aircraft carrier. It's hard work. But I think the longer this war goes on, the more scepticism there'll be. Yeah. And the other thing to bear in mind, getting back to one of the original questions about Trump, if he gets elected later this year, he's a wild card, but I wouldn't put it past him to put more pressure on the Ukrainians to do some kind of deal. And that could have a huge impact on public consciousness.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that will happen, but I just don't rule it out.
Are you finished? I'm Natalia, and I represent Russian community here in Australia. So, first of all, my question would be here: why Australia? Australia is not part of the NATO, right? Why is Australia so much involved in conflict? And second, I do remember back in 2018 we have attended a Western Sydney lecture, and it was done by ex-Ukrainian ambassador, and they were then already, asking for weapons to join NATO and EU, but they were asking only for, begging. Now they're demanding the weapon. So, what are your thoughts? Why do Australia is so much involved?
Well, you're quite right, Natalia. We're not a NATO ally, but neither is Japan nor Singapore. And they also take the same position as the Australian government. But they're allies. I think Singapore is the only country in ASEAN that actually supports the Ukraine mission. The other countries are either sympathetic to Russia or just neutral. Look, there's a long tradition in Australian foreign policy where we support our great and powerful friend, whether it's Britain in the first half of the 20th century or the United States in the second half. And I see Canberra's thinking on this issue in keeping with past Australian governments that have, for the most part, given strong support to our great, powerful security ally. And I don't agree with it. I think this is one of those issues like the Iraq War where any Australian government had every right to oppose both these initiatives, and we should be more focused on engagement in our own neighbourhood. But I think to answer your question is history. You know, we have this long tradition of supporting our great and powerful friends, and I think that has a hold on public opinion in both major parties.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, everybody. Do you have one more question? Okay.
Robert Escort. We mentioned Finland, and that Finland had little interest, or Russia perhaps had little interest in Finland. What about the Baltic states? That's my question. We can also ask you for comment on one other thing, which I think, history repeats itself. And I can't help thinking back, right now, Ukraine is prevented from effectively using Western weapons into Russia. The Spanish Civil War, the West also constrained their ability to help the Republic. It just seems to me, you either got all in or you get out.
Yeah. Well, I think the Biden administration, there was a piece, front page story in the New York Times just a few days ago about how the cabinet, the Biden administration's national security team is divided on this very question you raised about allowing Ukraine to use Western weapons against Russia. And I think Biden, although I've been very critical of him tonight, and I didn't get into the detail about the negotiations Biden had with Putin and the Ukrainians in 2021 and early 2022 that set the scene for this crisis. I think he's mishandled relations with Russia, but I think he's smart enough not to provoke them, because there's always a risk of this getting out of control. And if the Russians, and I don't think they would, but if they did, if they were on the back foot, they'd be more likely to use tactical nuclear weapons if it's near abroad, and the Americans would do everything they could to shut it down. America has no interest in a thermonuclear war with a country, the great power, a declining great power, with a vast arsenal of nuclear weapons. I think Biden recognises that. There's just no offside to it.
Do you think, what about the Baltic states vulnerable?
I just don't think Putin's got other countries on his hit list. I mean, certainly not from a military perspective. I think he's more focused on wrecking Ukraine so it doesn't become part of NATO.
Yeah.
I think this is the fundamental point tonight. The taproot of this crisis is not contrary to the conventional wisdom in the West, Putin's desire to recreate a Russian empire. It's Putin's desire to wreck Ukraine so it doesn't become part of NATO. NATO expansion is an existential threat from the perspective of most Russians, whether they're on the left or on the right, whether they're nationalists or assimilationists. I think it's a potent issue, and I think I try to demonstrate that in the 1990s, smart Americans recognised the dangers in NATO expansion.
Yeah.